Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most gracious. This is Ahmad Zahran speaking, and welcome to our lecture for today. As we are going to continue our study in neuroanatomy after we finished studying the anatomy of the brain, and the cerebellum, and the brainstem. But there are some important structures that we have mentioned before that we need to study more in details. Do you remember the cranial nerves? Yes, the 12 cranial nerves that arise from the brain and the brainstem. Yes, let's remember them. Cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve number 6, the abducent nerve. Cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. And cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. How amazing is that? I'm very happy that you do remember everything about the cranial nerves. But what we want to study now is the journey of each of these nerves. We know that they arise from the brain and the brainstem. But where are they going to go, and what is their destination? Welcome to our new series about the cranial nerve journeys, and today, in the first lecture, we're going to study the anatomy and the journey of the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve. Generally speaking, about cranial nerves and about peripheral nerves, each of these nerves is like a wire, an electric wire, that carries electric information from one place to another. Either this information is coming from the extremities to the central nervous system, and in this case, this will be a sensory nerve. It's like a spy bringing information to the central nervous system. Or it could be a motor nerve that takes information from the central nervous system and reaches the effector organ, either a muscle or a gland. Okay, so we have two types of nerves in general. We have a sensory nerve that brings information to the central nervous system, and we have a motor nerve that takes information from the central nervous system to the effector organ. Okay, that's nice. But some nerves are mixed. Some nerves contain sensory fibers and motor fibers. Okay, that's nice. So, whenever I'm talking about any cranial nerve and any peripheral nerve in the future, I'm going to mention if this nerve is a sensory nerve or a motor nerve or a mixed nerve that contains both sensory and motor fibers. And today, we're going to start studying the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve. And the first information I'm going to give you about it is that the olfactory nerve is purely a sensory fiber that carries information about the sense of smell. Ah, that's amazing. Okay, let's start our journey of the olfactory nerve. If I give you a very nice red flower and I ask you to smell the scent of this flower, what are you going to do? The first thing you're going to do is put the flower near your nose. You're not going to put it near your ear or near your elbow or near your eye, because you know that you smell with your nose. Well, this is a very instinctive reaction. When you want to smell something, you just put it near your nose. Okay. How do we smell with the nose? Well, actually, not the whole area of the nose is important for smelling, but the roof of the nasal cavity contains important olfactory receptors. It is in this olfactory mucosa, in the roof of the nasal cavity, that there are receptors for olfaction. These receptors are cells that have certain capabilities to transform the different chemicals of the different scents that you smell into electric charges. And then these electric charges should pass from the nasal cavity and into the cranial cavity through the olfactory nerve And then this olfactory nerve will take all this information to the brain that is going to process this information and give you the sense of smelling. Okay, let's start the journey from the beginning. So, you're holding a flower in your hand and putting it near your nose, and the chemicals of the scent just ascend in your nasal cavity up into the roof of the nasal cavity towards the olfactory mucosa, where we have receptors. These receptors can sense these chemicals and transform the different information it gets into electric charges. Well, these electric charges will then pass from the nasal cavity into the cranial cavity via olfactory rootlets. These small rootlets here, they are called the olfactory rootlets. They pass from the nasal cavity to the cranial cavity. But how are they going to pass? The roof of the nasal cavity is composed of a bone that we call the ethmoid bone. But actually the ethmoid bone has two surfaces. One that is present in the nasal cavity, which is considered the roof of the nasal cavity, and the other surface is in the opposite side. It's inside the cranial cavity. It forms a part of the anterior skull base. Okay, as you see here in the middle, this is the skull base, and this part is called the anterior cranial fossa. The floor of the anterior cranial fossa is composed of many bones. One of them is called the ethmoid bone. As you can see here, this is the ethmoid bone that's present in the middle. Okay, but can you see something? That this ethmoid bone here is not just a simple bone. It's pierced. It's like a sieve. It contains many holes. Okay, many punctures in here. Okay, I think these holes are the holes that allow the olfactory rootlets to pass from the nasal cavity to the cranial cavity. Okay, that's nice. Okay, I understand now. This part of the ethmoid bone is called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. It's cribriform, it's pierced, it's like a sieve. Why? To allow the rootlets of the olfactory nerve to pass from the nasal cavity and into the cranial cavity. Okay, that's amazing. Okay, so this part of the skull base of the anterior cranial fossa is called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. We know it's a part of the ethmoid bone. We know that it has two surfaces. One surface below that's related to the roof of the nasal cavity, and one surface above is related to the skull base. And we know that through these holes of the cribriform plate, the rootlets of the olfactory nerve will pass from the olfactory mucosa below, taking information from the receptors, and into the cranial cavity. Okay, that's nice. Let's continue the journey. All these rootlets that have arrived safely inside the cranial cavity in the anterior cranial fossa, they will gather together to form the first part of the cranial nerve, which is the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb. This swollen part here of the olfactory nerve is called the olfactory bulb. Okay. And then these fibers will pass backwards from the olfactory bulb through the olfactory tract. The olfactory tract. Okay, it goes backwards here, still lying on the bone of the anterior cranial fossa, on the skull base, and still related to the olfactory sulcus of the brain of the frontal lobe. Okay, and then it goes backwards till it reaches this point. It's called the olfactory trigone. The olfactory trigone, in which the fibers of the olfactory tract will divide into two parts, or two olfactory stria. Two olfactory stria. One medial olfactory stria that goes medially, and one lateral olfactory stria that goes laterally. And you can see here that between the medial and lateral olfactory stria we have the anterior perforated substance. You remember that? Yes, the anterior perforated substance that is present here in the base of the brain. Okay, that's nice. Let's revise what we know about this journey now. So everything started in the olfactory mucosa, where the chemicals of the scent were transformed into electric impulses by the receptors here, the olfactory receptors, and then these impulses will pass through the olfactory rootlets, through the cribriform plate of ethmoid, to reach the cranial cavity, and then these rootlets will gather together, forming the olfactory bulb, and then the olfactory bulb will go backwards as the olfactory tract, okay, lying on the skull base and related to the olfactory sulcus of the inferior surface of the frontal lobe of the brain, and then this olfactory tract will end as the olfactory trigone, where it divides into two olfactory stria, one medial and one lateral olfactory stria, and between them you can see is the anterior perforated substance of the brain. Okay, let's continue the journey. Impulses will pass from the olfactory stria to reach the brain itself. These olfactory impulses and this information that's coming from the nose are finally reaching the brain. But where exactly do these fibers terminate? It's the primary olfactory cortex that's present in the temporal lobe of the brain, in the pyriform cortex. This is the cortex that receives impulses from the olfactory nerve that are related to olfaction. Okay, so in this pyriform cortex, impulses arrive from the olfactory nerve to be processed as olfaction, as odors, as different odors. But you have to know that smelling sensation is not just a simple sensation. It's not like touch. The smelling sensation, as well as the taste sensation, they are involved much with emotions, and they're involved much with memory. Sometimes when you smell something good, you feel happy. And when you smell something bad, you feel unhappy, you feel sad, or you feel anxious because of just the smell. And also sometimes the smells are related to memory. Sometimes when you smell something, you remember someone or you remember some place just by the smell. That's why the pyriform cortex, as the primary olfactory cortex, it sends much information to different areas and different cortical areas of the brain. In the temporal lobe, it's directly connected to the parahippocampal gyrus, which is involved in memory. It's also connected to the amygdala in the uncus of the temporal lobe, which has direct connections with the autonomic nervous system in the hypothalamus, which gives you the autonomic reactions to what you're smelling. Like when you're smelling delicious food, you think you want to eat this food, then you will find yourself having some salivation in your mouth. That's an autonomic response. What started this autonomic reaction of salivation? Well, the impulses that arrived in the pyriform cortex have projected to the amygdala and then into the autonomic nervous system to start the parasympathetic nervous system and to start your salivation. It's amazing. Okay. What else? Also, the pyriform cortex, or the primary olfactory cortex, projects information to the frontal lobe and the orbitofrontal cortex in the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. This orbitofrontal cortex receives information not just from the pyriform cortex about the smelling sensation, but also from the visual cortex, but also from the gustatory cortex that's related to taste, and from all other sensory cortices, and it integrates all these sensations together to give you the correct processing of information and give you the sense of reward, whether it's happiness or sadness or anxiety or excitement or whatever your reaction will be, and will help you to decide and take decisions, and will help you to think and take important decisions according to these different senses. How amazing is that? But let's get back to the journey of the nerve. We remember we stopped at the olfactory trigone, and the olfactory trigone then divided into medial and lateral olfactory stria. It's actually the lateral olfactory stria that passes all these information, most of these information, They pass via the lateral olfactory striae to reach the pyriform cortex, the primary olfactory cortex of the temporal lobe, and then this cortex will pass it to other areas like the parahippocampal gyrus, the amygdala, and the orbitofrontal cortex. But what about the medial olfactory striae? The medial olfactory striae actually will pass the information from one nerve to the opposite nerve in the opposite side. It's actually connected with the opposite olfactory nerve by the anterior commissure. You remember the anterior commissure? Yes. The anterior commissure that's present in the anterior wall of the third ventricle. Yes, that's it. This anterior commissure has commissural fibers between the medial olfactory striae of both olfactory nerves. It connects them together. So, to sum up, this is the olfactory nerve. It has a very nice journey. Things started in the olfactory mucosa when the receptors were able to convert the different scents and the chemicals of different scents into electric impulses, and they pass along the olfactory rootlets through the cribriform plate of ethmoid from the nasal cavity into the cranial cavity. The rootlets gather up together, forming the olfactory bulb, which goes backwards on the skull base and related to the olfactory sulcus of the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, and they go backwards as the olfactory tract till they reach the olfactory trigone, and then it divides into two stria, medial and lateral olfactory stria. The medial olfactory stria will communicate with the olfactory nerve on the opposite side via the anterior commissure, while the lateral olfactory stria will take most of the impulses to reach the primary olfactory cortex, which is the pyriform cortex in the temporal lobe, which will receive and translate the impulses of smell that are coming from the olfactory nerve. And the pyriform cortex itself is connected to other important cortices, so that smelling could be related to emotions and memories. It's connected with the parahippocampal gyrus, so that smelling sensation could be related to memory. It's related to the amygdala, so that you can have some emotional response to smelling sensation and autonomic response to smelling sensation. It's connected to the orbitofrontal cortex in the frontal lobe, so that you can have the sense of reward towards these smelling sensations. That's so much amazing. This is the journey of our first cranial nerve here. It's the olfactory nerve. We know everything about it now. I hope you do understand it. This is the lecture for today. The next lecture we're going to talk about the second cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve, and we are going to enjoy the journey of the optic nerve as well as what we call the visual pathway. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel and become a member of Neuroanatomy in English playlist. See you next lecture. This is Ahmad Zahran.